Hey guys, Sniz here, and in this video we're going to be going over the Corrupting Fever Rain of Arrows Scion that I played in Expedition League. Now, yes, that is a real build, and I was quite pleasantly surprised with how it turned out. And I do think I'd go as far as to say that this is probably one of the best builds that I have ever played in Path of Exile. So, let's get into the guide. Oh yeah, and if you didn't know, I live stream over at Twitch, so if you're looking for more Path of Exile streamers to watch in these very trying times, well, I'll be there. Corrupting Fever was introduced in patch 3.14 as a support skill to boost the damage of most physical damage over time builds. I believe that GGG's intent was that you would link it to a 4-link and it would add a bit of damage to your existing Fizz dot build. But in this build, we scaled the damage of Corrupting Fever via increasing levels, physical damage over time multiplier, and generic physical damage, to the point that Corrupting Fever deals a lot of damage on its own. So how does Corrupting Fever work? Well, Corrupting Fever requires you to pay a certain life cost to gain the Corrupting Fever buff for a set duration. Whilst this buff is active, your hit supply stacks of Corrupting Blood to enemies that deal physical damage over time. You can have up to 10 stacks of Corrupted Blood on an enemy, and spending a certain amount of life refreshes the Corrupting Fever buff duration. In this build, we use Rain of Arrows to apply our Corrupting Fever stacks, as Rain of Arrows has full screen coverage and is quite comfortable to play. We link Rain of Arrows to the life tap support, meaning that each time we attack, we spend a little bit of life, which then resets our Corrupting Fever buff duration. This means that we can pretty much have 100% uptime on Corrupting Fever as long as we attack once every few seconds. Now, like I've previously said, this build is probably one of the best builds I've ever played in PoE, and to give you an idea of what that means, this build can achieve more than 8,000 life depending on your gear, can easily achieve 6 million DPS with physical damage over time, has 78% attack block and 60% spell block with glancing blows, has blind on hit, maim on hit, life on kill, a lot of life regen, culling strike, is immune to curses, takes no extra damage from critical strikes, generates frenzies and boss fights, has permanent onslaught, and has permanent phasing, whilst being ranged with full screen coverage and quite a bit of movement speed. I've been curious about Corrupting Fever Rain of Arrows ever since Mathel played it back in 3.14, I believe, but I've never been happy with the numbers that I was able to achieve on PoB until I saw this profile on PoE Ninja. Yes, sadly, I am not the creator of this build, this player is. XXX Baboon XXX has made a magnificent build that they have min-maxed to near perfection. So feel free to take a look at the build via the PoE Ninja profile that I've linked in the description. But please, if you have any questions, refer them to me, do not message this player. I've been unable to make contact with this player myself, but I'm quite sure that they would not appreciate strangers spamming their inbox because of a video that I made. Now before we get into the rest of the guide, a big disclaimer. Since I've been curious about this build for quite some time, and it is the end of the league, I've gone full out non-budget with this build. So this build is quite expensive to set up, and I really don't recommend you try it out if you don't plan on spending quite a few exalts on it. That being said, in the PoB I have made a budget setup with budget gear and a budget tree if you really do want to try it out on a budget. Now I don't discuss the budget version in the video since I've only played the more expensive version, and I typically don't like making videos about builds or build versions that I haven't personally tested. We played this build as a Scion Ascendant, and unfortunately our first lab is quite underwhelming as we only take the 2 travel nodes up to the Duelist Ascendancy. Then for our second lab, we take the Duelist Ascendancy and specialize into Gladiator, giving us 50% block chance for attack and spell damage, 3% maximum attack block chance, 25% chance to blind enemies on hit with attacks, and most importantly, 25% more physical damage over time. And then for our second Ascendancy point, we take the first travel node to the Ranger Ascendancy. Then for our third lab, we take the second Travel Ascendancy node to the Ranger Ascendancy, and we also take the Ranger Ascendancy itself, specializing into Raider, giving us 10% increased movement speed, 10% chance to dodge attack hits, onslaught while on full frenzies, a way to generate frenzies against bosses, and also permanent phasing. And then for our final Ascendancy, once again this is quite underwhelming as we just take Path of the Duelist, and we don't use the Duelist start, this just gives us 3 additional skill points. So this is typically what the tree will look like. If we start at the top and work our way down, we take quite a few life nodes, then we use a large Thread of Hope to grab some Reservation, some life, and some physical damage overwhelming. Then apart from that, we pick up some life over here, glancing blows to double our spell and attack block, but make us take a little bit of damage from hits that we've blocked. Then we grab more life and resistance over here, some physical damage, attack speed, and some more life. Then we take jewel sockets wherever we can, as they are quite important, some armor and life, some increased damage if we've used a skill that costs life, and life on kill. More life over here with some armor and max res, and we also take imbalanced guard since we don't have a lot of armor. And then if we move down into the middle, we also take these nodes, which are extremely good for physical damage over time builds. And then we also use an Unnatural Instinct. This Unnatural Instinct gives us some skill effect duration, some regen, some physical damage, and some AoE. And then we also use a Might of the Meek right here to boost the bonuses from the resistances that we gain over here, these physical damage nodes right here, the regen nodes right here, and very importantly, this increases the bonuses from all of these nodes quite significantly, whilst having Constitution just outside of its radius. And then we also use 2 cluster jewel setups, both with the large and mediums, right here, and we also use a few rare jewels, which will be discussed in the gearing section of this guide. As for the Resolute Technique Keystone, it's quite simple. If you plan on playing with Tailwind and Elusive Boots, don't take the Keystone, and if you plan on not using Tailwind or Elusive Boots, do take the Keystone. In this build, we use 2 8 passive physical damage large cluster jewels, with the ideal notables being Battle Hardened, Master the Fundamentals, and Furious Assault. In our first large cluster, we use 2 4 or 5 passive Aura Effect medium clusters with the notables Master of Command and Replenishing Presence. Now, since we're using 2 Master of Command clusters, this means that we can run a banner skill absolutely free, meaning that our war banner reserves no mana or life. Then in our second large cluster, we have 2 4 or 5 passive physical damage over time medium clusters with the notables Student of Decay and Flow of Life. Now, the notables on these are quite flexible. We use these 2 as it gives some chaos resistance, max life, and life regen, but if you want to prioritize damage, you can exchange one of the notables for something like Blood Artist. For the bow that we use in this build, and preferably we want this to be a thicket bow as it has the highest attacks per second, we want the modifiers +1 level of socketed gems, generic damage over time multiplier, physical damage over time multiplier from Betrayal, and then crafted on +2 level of socketed support gems and increased damage over time. Then for the Quiver, we use the Rear Guard unique Quiver as this synergizes really well with our build. It gives us projectile speed, making Rain of Arrows feel very smooth to play. It gives a ton of armor, but most importantly, it gives attack and spell block chance. For our helmet, we use the Viridi's Veil unique helmet, which is a drop from the Maven boss fight. Now, this helmet is absolutely amazing for this build as it makes us immune to curses, it makes us not take extra damage from critical strikes, but more importantly, it allows us to fit in all of our auras just with an Enlighten level 3 because it boosts our Enlighten level to an Enlighten level 5. For our body armor, we use an Astral Plate with Hunter and Redeemer influence. Now, the only important modifiers here are you can apply an additional curse from Hunter and increase effect of your non-curse aura skills from Redeemer. If you do plan on using Tailwind in this build, you might want to consider getting attack critical strike chance on your chest piece as well. For the gloves, we use rare Apothecary's gloves with Warlord influence and Hunter influence. Now, the most important mod here is the Hunter mod, 2 physical damage over time multiplier, and preferably we want this mod to be elevated for more damage. Apart from that, we then want the Warlord mod, increased damage over time, and those are the only 2 important mods. The other mods that you care about here are life, resistances, and maybe some dexterity. In this build, we just use basic boots with life, resistances, and movement speed, and if you want, crafted on cannot be frozen. Now, if you do want your build to move a little bit faster, you can use Tailwind elusive boots, although I do recommend that you at least have some attack crit on your chest piece for you to be able to gain Tailwind and elusive more reliably. For our amulet slot, we use a turquoise amulet with Warlord and Hunter influence with the modifiers +1 level of all physical skill gems, +1 level of all strength skill gems, and physical damage over time multiplier, but we also craft on skills cost no mana or life while focused. This crafted modifier on our amulet is very important. In this build, we have a level 30 6-linked Corrupting Fever. That means activating Corrupting Fever costs 11,000 life, and even in a very min-maxed endgame version of this build, you'll only have about 8 or 9,000 life. So thanks to this craft, if we're focused, we're able to activate our Corrupting Fever for free. For our first ring, we use a magic Warlord Vermilion ring with the modifier Curse enemies with vulnerability on hit and crafted on life. And for our second ring, we also have a magic Vermilion ring with Alder influence with the modifier Trigger level 12 Poacher's Mark when you hit a rare or unique enemy and crafted on life. Now always be sure that both your rings are magic rarity to benefit from both the Verity Veil conditional modifiers. Then for our belt slot, we use an Alder Stygian Vice with the modifiers percentage increased maximum life and increased global physical damage with some life and resistances where possible. In no of my previous build guides have I ever talked about belt enchants, as they usually don't add too much to a build. But in this build, the belt enchant enemies maimed by you take 8% increased damage over time adds a substantial amount of damage to your build, and I do recommend you try and get this on your belt. Then for the Abyssal Jewel in your Stygian Vice, we want some life, and the modifier enemies maimed by you take 5% increased damage over time. For the unique jewels used in this build, we use an Unnatural Instinct, a Thread of Hope with a large ring, a Might of the Meek, all showcased in the tree section of this guide, but then we also use a Watcher's Eye with a modifier plus 2 damage over time multiplier while affected by Malevolence. Now, as always, the build uses quite a few rare jewels, and these rare jewels are used to solve whatever you might still need after gearing your character, but preferably we'd want global increased physical damage, percentage increased maximum life, and percentage increased damage over time, with then added resistances or added stats dependent on what you need. For the flasks, as always, for the first flask, I recommend you get an instant life flask, and then apart from this flask, all other flasks are really flexible. So what I recommend you use is a quartz flask for a little bit of extra attack and spell dodge, a quicksilver flask for some movement speed, a jade flask for some evasion, and a sulfur flask for 40% increased damage and consecrated ground. But like I said, these flasks are extremely flexible, and you can swap them out to your personal preference. For our Corrupting Fever 6 link, and very important, this 6 link needs to be in your bow to gain max benefit from your bow, we have a level 21 Corrupting Fever, linked to Awakened Brutality, linked to Life Tap support, linked to Awakened Swift Affliction, linked to Efficacy, and then linked to preferably a level 4 Empower. Then for our second 6 link that goes into your chest, we have Rain of Arrows, linked to Faster Attacks, linked to Culling Strike, linked to life gained on hit support, linked to life tap support, and maim support. Now, you could go an extra step and get the alternate qualities as shown right here, but they aren't life changing and the normal variants would work just as well. Then for our auras, and preferably you'd want all 3 to be level 21, we have a Malevolence linked to a Pride, linked to a Herald of Purity, all 3 linked to a level 3 Enlighten, and like previously mentioned, these go into your Verity's Veil. Then for our utility 4 link, we have a level 1 Flame Dash, linked to a level 20 Steel Skin, linked to a level 20 Blood Rage, linked to a life tap support. Then for our last few gems, we have our War Banner, and a Portal, and a level 1 Stormbrand. Now, the reason we use a level 1 Stormbrand is that Stormbrand can also apply Corrupting Fever stacks. And if you're fighting an intense boss fight and you don't have a lot of time to stand still and attack, just throwing down a Stormbrand will keep a few stacks active and will most likely kill the boss for you. For the Pantheon, for the Major God, I recommend you take the Soul of Lunaris, as I really feel like this is a very powerful and undervalued Pantheon for ranged builds. And then for the Minor Pantheon, I recommend you start out with the Soul of Shikari if you don't have good Chaos Resistance, but if your Chaos Resistance is pretty good, I recommend you switch to the Soul of Ralakesh. For Bandits, if you're struggling with resistances, you can always go with Alira, although Alira is a bit inefficient. I do really recommend you go with Eramir for the 2 skill points once you've fixed resistances, but funny enough, Oak is actually a viable option for this build as well. And that is it for the guide. Now, I know this is a little bit different than the usual builds that I share on this channel. I just had way too much fun to not share it with you guys. If you decide to play something similar, I hope you have as much fun as I've had. And that's it from me. My name is Sniz, and I will see you guys in the next one. Bye. So for those of you who don't already know, this weekend is the start of Anomaleague 2.0. Now, Anomaleague is a new per-league private league with interesting rules and restrictions that's open to everyone. So if you don't have anything to do for the next few days, feel free to join us. Link to Lolcohol's video discussing the rules and everything you need to know to join in the description.